was a Tuesday morning, and I was in my son's kitchen watching the coffee drip into the pot when my daughter-in-law walked in and looked at me like I'd just tracked mud across her freshly mopped floor. I hadn't done anything. I was just standing there. "You left the cabinet open again," she said. "Not good morning, not hello, just that." I turned around and sure enough, the cabinet above the coffee maker was open about 2 inches. I had grabbed a mug and forgotten to close it. A small thing, the kind of thing my husband used to do every single morning of our 41 years together, and I never once made him feel like a stranger in his own home because of it. "I'm sorry, Courtney," I said, and I closed it. She poured herself a cup of the coffee I had just made, didn't offer me any, and walked back to the bedroom. I stood in that kitchen alone, and I thought, Beverly, what did you do? That is a question I would spend the next 11 months asking myself. My name is Beverly Harmon. I am 67 years old. I spent 30 years as a licensed practical nurse at a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, and I raised 2 children mostly by myself after my husband Warren got sick and couldn't work anymore. I am not a woman who falls apart easily. I have held the hands of people taking their last breath. I have driven through ice storms to get to a shift. I have eaten vending machine sandwiches for dinner and called it fine because we needed the money, and I wasn't going to complain about it. So when Warren passed 3 years ago after a long illness, I thought I knew how to handle hard things. I was wrong. Grief does something to your judgment. People don't talk about that enough. You make decisions in that fog that you never would have made with a clear head. You sign things you shouldn't sign. You listen to people you shouldn't listen to. You convince yourself that leaning on family is wisdom instead of recognizing when it's desperation. Warren and I had a house in a neighborhood in Columbus we'd lived in for 22 years. 4 bedrooms, a backyard with a garden I had planted and replanted every spring since 1998. When he died, the house suddenly felt like it had tripled in size. Every hallway was too long. Every room was too quiet. My son Jason called me about 2 months after the funeral. "Mum," he said, "why are you rattling around in that big house by yourself? You should come stay with us. Save some money. We have the guest room." He made it sound so reasonable. He always does. Jason is 41. He works in IT. He and Courtney have been married for 8 years, and they live in a newer subdivision outside of Cincinnati, about a 2-hour drive from Columbus. They don't have children. Courtney works in marketing, and she is the kind of woman who labels everything in her pantry and considers it a personality. I told Jason I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 months, and the more I thought about it, the more the silence in my house pressed in on me. My neighbor Pat kept saying I should stay put. "Beverly, don't do it," she said, standing in my driveway one afternoon in October. "Once you give that up, you can't get it back." But I was lonely and I was tired, and my knees had started giving me trouble, and I thought, Jason is my son. He loves me. This will be fine. I put the house on the market in November. It sold in 19 days for $212,000. I signed the closing papers on a Wednesday, and by Friday I had a cashier's check and 4 suitcases and my cat Oliver in a carrier. And I drove to Cincinnati. Now I need to explain something about that money, because it is important and because people always ask. Jason had helped me go through Warren's final expenses. The hospital bills, the supplemental insurance claims, the funeral, the headstone. Warren had a small life insurance policy, but after everything it mostly covered what we owed. What was left in our joint account was not much, maybe $18,000. I was drawing Social Security, $1,862 a month, and I had a small pension from the hospital, around $400 a month. Combined, that was enough to live modestly, but it was not enough to rent anything decent on my own in Columbus without eating into savings. When Jason suggested I move in and contribute to household expenses, we agreed I would pay him $800 a month toward utilities and groceries. He said the rest was mine to keep. I thought I was being smart. I thought I was managing. So when I moved in, I took the $212,000 from the house sale and I divided it in my head. "Keep it safe, Beverly. Don't touch it. That is your future. I opened a new savings account and transferred it in. I told Jason about it. He said, "Good, Mom. That's smart. I should have kept that information to myself." The first few weeks were fine. I cooked dinner a few nights a week. I kept my space clean. I tried to be invisible, the way you do when you're a guest in someone else's home, even if that someone is your own child. I walked Oliver in the mornings. I called my daughter Pamela in Portland every Sunday. Then the small things started. The cabinet, the coffee maker settings, the way I loaded the dishwasher. Courtney had a particular way she wanted everything done, and when I didn't do it exactly right, she would come behind me and redo it without saying a word, just loudly enough that I could hear her correcting my work. I told myself it was her home and she had the right to run it the way she wanted. I told myself that for about 4 months. Then one afternoon in March, I was in the kitchen making chicken soup. I do it the way my mother taught me, long and slow, with the whole chicken and the celery and the carrots and a bay leaf. It takes the better part of a day and the house smells wonderful, and it is one of the things I have always been proud of. Jason grew up on that soup. When he was sick as a child, it was the only thing he wanted. Courtney came into the kitchen and stood behind me, and I could feel her looking at the pot. "Why do you cook it for so long?" she said. "It needs time," I said. "The collagen breaks down and the broth gets rich. That's how you get the flavor." She made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Something dismissive. "We have a store about 5 minutes away," she said. "You know they sell broth in cartons." I kept stirring. I heard Jason come in the back door from the garage. I thought, good. He can sit down and we can all have dinner, and it will be a normal evening. Courtney said something to him I couldn't quite hear. Then she came back into the kitchen and she reached past me and turned the burner up so high I had to grab the pot handle to keep it from boiling over. "Courtney," I said, "please don't do that. If it boils too hard, the broth goes cloudy." She looked at me, and I want to be precise about how she looked at me because I have thought about it many times since. It was not anger exactly. It was contempt, the kind of look you give something that is in your way. "I don't care about cloudy broth," she said. "I care that you have been in this kitchen since 10 o'clock this morning making a mess, and dinner is nowhere close to ready." "It'll be ready by 6, I said. "It's already 5:45. I turned back to the stove. I adjusted the burner back down. My hands were steady. I have steady hands. 30 years of nursing will do that. Then she reached past me again and grabbed the wooden spoon right out of my hand. "This is my kitchen," she said. "You don't get to tell me how to run my own kitchen." I turned around to face her and I said very quietly, "Courtney, please give me back the spoon." What happened next took about 4 seconds. She raised the spoon and she brought it down hard on the edge of the pot, which sent a splash of hot broth across my wrist. And she said, loudly, clearly, "Maybe if you cooked like a normal person, this wouldn't take all day." The burn on my wrist was real. I looked down at it and I thought, that is a real burn. That is going to blister. Jason was in the doorway. I looked at him. He looked at me. Then he looked at Courtney. And then my son said, "Mom, maybe just let her finish dinner." He walked back into the living room. I stood in that kitchen alone with a burn on my wrist and my pot of soup still on the stove, and I understood something clearly. For the first time in months, I was not a guest in their home. I was a burden they were tolerating for $800 a month. I went to my room and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I held a cold, wet washcloth to my wrist, and I called Pamela. Pamela is my daughter. She is 39. She is a nurse like I was, and she has a studio apartment in Portland and not a single inch of extra space, and she already has her own complicated life, and the last thing I was going to do was put myself on her doorstep. But I called her because I needed to hear her voice. She was furious. She said I needed to leave. She said what Courtney had done was assault and I should call the police. I told her I just needed to think. After I hung up, I looked around the guest room and I counted, not for the first time, how much of my life was in those 4 suitcases and a cat carrier. My garden was gone. My neighbor was gone. My house was gone. And the money I got for it was sitting in a bank account I'd been too afraid to touch because I thought if I was careful enough, I could get through this without needing it. I left the next morning. I didn't tell Jason I was going. I didn't want another conversation where he explained to me why Courtney's behavior was actually my fault. I packed what I could fit back into the suitcases. I put Oliver in his carrier, and I left a check on the kitchen table for that month's $800 because I still believed, even then, in honoring what I had agreed to. I drove out of their neighborhood at 7 in the morning, and I sat in a gas station parking lot on the edge of Cincinnati. And I called 3 hotels before I found one that allowed cats. 67 years old. A burn on my wrist. A cat in a carrier. Sitting in a gas station parking lot trying to remember my own debit card PIN because my hands were shaking. That was my lowest point. I want to tell you that because I think sometimes these stories skip past the hard parts too fast. They jump from the bad moment to the triumphant comeback without giving you the real weight of the in-between. But the in-between is the part that matters. The hotel room with the beige walls and the hum of the air conditioner, and Oliver sitting on the pillow looking at me like he understood. The drive-through dinners. The nights I couldn't sleep and sat in the chair by the window watching the parking lot. The phone calls to Pamela where I tried to sound steadier than I was. I stayed in that hotel for 2 weeks, $91 a night. That is $1,274 I had not planned to spend. During those 2 weeks, I did something I probably should have done 6 months earlier. I started going through Warren's papers. Warren was a meticulous man. He kept files for everything, organized in hanging folders in a filing cabinet I had moved to the hotel room's closet. I had gone through some of it after he died, enough to handle the immediate things, but I hadn't looked at all of it. Grief and exhaustion had made me sloppy. There were folders I had skipped because I assumed they weren't urgent. In the 3rd week of April, sitting on the hotel bed while Oliver slept against my leg, I opened a folder labeled Property Secondary. Inside was a deed. Warren, it turned out, had inherited a small parcel of land from his uncle in 2009, 3 acres outside of a town called Granville, Ohio, about 40 minutes east of Columbus. I had known about it in a vague way, the way you know about something your husband mentions once and then never brings up again. I had completely forgotten it existed. The deed was in Warren's name alone because he had inherited it before we were married. Technically, but in Ohio, a surviving spouse has rights to inherited property under certain conditions, and the land had never been sold. I called a real estate attorney in Columbus the next morning. Her name was Catherine Bowen, and she was 64 years old, and she had the kind of direct, no patience for nonsense manner that I immediately trusted. I drove to Columbus and sat across from her desk, and I told her everything. She looked at the deed. She looked at my marriage certificate. She looked at Warren's death certificate. She said, "Mrs. Harmon, do you have any idea what land in Granville is selling for right now?" I did not. She told me. I want to describe how that felt, but I'm not sure I have the right words. It was not joy exactly. It was more like the floor steadying under you after you have been standing on something that kept shifting. It was solid ground. I had forgotten what solid ground felt like. 3 acres in Granville had recently sold for an average of around $90,000 an acre, driven up by people moving out of Columbus into smaller towns after the pandemic years changed how people thought about where they wanted to live. Catherine said we could likely get between $250,000 and $270,000 for the parcel, depending on how we handled the listing. I drove back to the hotel, and I sat in the parking lot for a while before I went inside. I thought about Warren. I thought about how he would have gotten a kick out of this. He always said that land was the one thing they weren't making more of. The sale took 4 months to close. During that time, I found an apartment in a small complex in Westerville, just north of Columbus, that allowed cats and had a first-floor unit available. I used a portion of my house sale savings to cover the deposit and first and last month's rent. I moved in with my 4 suitcases and Oliver and a few pieces of furniture I bought second-hand from a woman in my new neighborhood named Ruth, who was downsizing. Ruth is 72 and she has a garden, and she brings me tomatoes in the summer. She is the first real friend I have made since I left Columbus the first time, and I do not take that lightly. When the land sale closed, I received $263,000 after attorney fees and taxes. I did not call Jason to tell him. Pamela called me the night the wire came through, and I could hear her crying on the phone. Not sad crying, but the other kind, the kind where you have been holding your breath for a long time and you finally let it out. "You're okay, Mom," she said. "You're actually okay." "I know," I said, and for the first time in almost a year, I meant it. I need to tell you something about what happened with Jason because I know that is what people want to know, and I am going to tell it plainly, without dressing it up. About 2 months after I moved into my apartment, Jason called me. His voice had a different texture than it had in months. Careful. A little thin. He and Courtney, he said, had separated. I let the silence sit for a moment before I said anything. He told me things had not been good between them for a while. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he was sorry about what happened with the soup, the way he had said what he said. He called it handling it badly. That was his phrase. Handling it badly. I want to be careful here, because I am 67 years old, and I have watched enough of life to know that holding on to bitterness is a kind of slow damage that only hurts the person holding it. I am not a bitter woman, but I'm also no longer a woman who accepts a small, vague apology for a large, specific injury and calls it even. I told Jason I was glad he was thinking about things. I told him I was doing well. I told him that if he wanted to have a real conversation about what had happened in his house, I was open to that. But it would need to be an actual conversation, not a summary. He said he understood. We have had 2 of those conversations since then. They have been hard. He has cried, which is not something I have seen him do since he was a teenager. I have told him things I probably should have told him years ago about learning to protect the people you love even when it's uncomfortable, about what it means to be a son. I don't know where we will land. I know I love him. I know I will not go back to a situation where I am dependent on anyone else for my basic stability. Those 2 things can both be true at the same time. My apartment has 2 bedrooms. The second one I use for my sewing, which I had given up for years because Warren's illness took up so much of our space and energy, and I had quietly set myself aside. I have a cutting table now, and a good machine and a design wall made from a piece of flannel I pinned to the spare bedroom door. I am making a quilt for Pamela. It is taking a long time because I keep changing my mind about the colors, but I am in no hurry. Oliver has figured out how to open the kitchen cabinet where I keep his treats. I don't know how he does it. I have watched him 3 times and I still cannot follow the logic. Every morning I come out to find the bag pulled to the edge of the shelf and sometimes on the floor. I close the cabinet and I make my coffee and I think about the woman who apologized for leaving a cabinet 2 inches open in someone else's kitchen. I will never apologize for taking up space again. I want to say one more thing before I'm done, because it is the thing I most want the people watching this to hear. I had $212,000 in a savings account when I was sitting in that hotel parking lot in Cincinnati. I was not actually penniless. I was not actually without options, but I felt like I was, because the grief and the dependence and the slow erosion of being treated like a nuisance in my own son's home had made me forget that I had resources. It had made me forget who I was before all of it. The danger was never really the money. The danger was letting someone else's treatment of me become the story I told myself about my own worth. If you are watching this and you are in a home where you are made to feel small, please hear me. The size of the space you take up is not determined by how much room other people are willing to give you. You take your space. You don't ask for it. I am 67 years old, and I live alone with my cat in an apartment with a cutting table in the second bedroom, and on Sunday mornings I make my coffee and I stand at the window and I watch the light come into the parking lot and I think, Beverly, you are all right. And I am. I've thought a lot about the chain of events that led me to that hotel parking lot in Cincinnati with a burn on my wrist and a cat in a carrier. And what I keep coming back to is this. None of it happened all at once. It never does. It started with small surrenders. The apology for an open cabinet. The silence when the coffee maker settings got changed. Each one felt like the reasonable thing to do in the moment. You tell yourself you're being gracious. You tell yourself that keeping the peace is a form of strength. But there is a difference between grace and disappearing. And I crossed that line without noticing. Courtney didn't become who she was on the day she grabbed that spoon. She became it gradually, because every time she pushed, I stepped back. That is not her fault alone. I taught her, slowly and without meaning to, that stepping back was what I did, and Jason learned the same thing. He watched me absorb it and say nothing, and he concluded that it was acceptable because I had concluded that it was acceptable first. That is the part I had to sit with. Not the anger at them. The anger is easy, but the harder question of what I had allowed to become normal. When I found that folder with Warren's deed in it, something shifted in me that had nothing to do with the money. It was the recognition that I had been carrying resources I didn't know I had, and that I had been living as though I had nothing. That is a particular kind of poverty that has nothing to do with your bank account. It is what happens when you let someone else's assessment of your worth become the one you operate by. Beverly Harmon, you have a nursing license and 40 years of getting hard things done. You raised 2 kids, you drove through ice storms, you held dying people's hands and didn't flinch. That woman did not disappear when Warren died. She got quiet for a while, but she did not disappear. Hardship either clarifies you or it hollows you out. The difference, I think, is whether you let it be something that happened to you, full stop, or whether you eventually pick it up and look at it and ask what it is trying to show you about yourself. I spent 11 months in a fog, and then I sat in a hotel room in Westerville, and I opened a filing cabinet and I started paying attention again. That was the turn, not the deed, the paying attention. Cause and consequence are not always tidy. Jason is not a villain. He is a man who learned to avoid conflict and married a woman who exploited that and let his mother absorb the cost of it. That has consequences, and he is living them now, not as punishment, just as the natural result of choices compounding over time. The same way my choice to stay quiet had consequences. The same way my choice to finally leave had consequences. Better ones. If you take nothing else from what I've shared, take this. The life you want does not require anyone's permission. Not your son's. Not your daughter-in-law's. Not even the version of yourself that got used to making do with less. You can decide, at any age, that the space you occupy is yours to fill. I am 67. I have a quilt in progress and a cat who steals his own treats, and a friend named Ruth who leaves tomatoes on my doorstep. I am, by any measure that matters, all right.